highlight that although these findings are specifically US soldiers and Marines, other countries, Canada, UK, Netherlands, Australia, France, have reported very similar findings. So while you may think, well, this is a US experience, I think that overall, this is, at least in Iraq and Afghanistan, a very similar experience for other nations who've served there. Next slide. Oh, it's just my outline. Next slide. So you all know this, but I always like to just, so bottom line up front here, military life is hard. We all know that. Combat and deployment results in a wide range of mental health and behavioral health changes. These changes include, we all know this already, PTSD, mild traumatic brain injury, depression, risk-taking behaviors, alcohol and substance use, impaired relationships, among many others. These changes can be immediate or they can be delayed. They can be pervasive. They can be debilitating, but not all of them are debilitating, and they can be very long-lasting. Thus, we need a comprehensive approach, a holistic approach, and I would argue that we need to employ evidence-based interventions wherever we're at. And oftentimes these need to occur over the lifespan of the veteran and their family. So don't be thinking we just do one thing one time and it's over. I will show you a military occupational mental health model that I think can help in thinking about where to intervene and who should intervene and what that intervention should look like. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but there's papers been written about this that I'm happy to share. Next slide. So let's first start off by highlighting just some of the key things that we know how combat impacts the mental health and well-being of soldiers and Marines. Next slide. So first we know that, we've been at war, the United States were at war various times for a couple of decades now. So one of the nice things about being at war for a couple of decades, besides the suffering and all of that happens, is we have plenty of opportunity to collect lots of data and test lots of interventions. So that's the bad side. But the good side is we've learned a lot. So next slide. So this is some of the papers. You'll see these slides. I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Next slide. So this slide here is the oldest slide, and I think the first slide really showing the rates or expected rates of post-traumatic stress disorder from a brigade combat team that deployed to Iraq. This was the very, very first study done showing that. And clearly, PTSD rates go up following a deployment to combat. Keep in mind before soldiers went into combat, PTSD rates were not zero. They're around 5% in garrison. So there are many ways individuals can suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Combat is just one of them. It's not the only one for sure. Next slide. So this slide shows just a sort of a function of the types of combat experiences and rates of percentage screening positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. And you can see if you were in a lot of firefights or in high combat scenarios, PTSD rates are higher. This is what one would expect, and that's what we found. Next slide. One of the things that's important is anger and aggression goes up as a function of combat. That's what this slide shows. So the take-home message is soldiers are more likely to become angry, aggressive if they've been in combat. Next slide. Soldiers drink more. Soldiers who have been in combat, when they return home, they drink more. I don't think this is surprising, but it's nice that we have data that actually corroborates that. Next slide. They're more likely to get into conflicts with family members, verbal conflicts, sometimes physical conflicts, conflicts with co-workers as a function. That's the aggression part. Next slide. So now I want to show you a military occupational health model that I think is useful in thinking about not just soldiers in combat, but just military occupation overall, but specifically as it applies to combat. Next slide. This model has been published by Dr. Amy Adler and myself, so you can read in more detail about it. Next slide. So here's a very, very busy slide, and I appreciate that. That's why I wanted to show you you could read about it at your leisure. But the idea is that if you think about the military as an occupation in which those who are serving encounter various traumatic events, various stressful events, involve separating service members from their family and loved ones. They put in themselves at risk. They may actually be injured. You can then talk about, well, where should our interventions be and who would be responsible for providing those interventions? So this model here basically says when you think about from soldiers entering the military and leaving the military, when they first come in, it's really a unit-focused approach in terms of selection and training and leader behaviors, leaders doing the right things at the right time to sustain soldiers. And then understanding the occupational risk. What are the occupational risks? Well, when you're at war, those become much more salient, right? That I could be injured or killed, or I'm undergoing the psychological stress of killing other people while avoid being killed. And then when there's an event, a death, then how do we intervene early with ceremonies, with screening, with psychological first aid, with mental health training? And then when we talk about treatment and recovery, this is where you get more of the clinicians involved in, right? These early interventions in the treatment recovery phase. So early on, it's really the leaders at the unit level, the individual level, that as you move through experiences, then you start employing behavioral health care providers, chaplains, and other folks who can sustain service, but they still working together. At every stage, everybody has a role. It's not 100% unit, it's primarily unit. Maybe behavioral health care providers, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, they're advising in these earlier stages, but then they get more involved in this, obviously in the treatment and the recovery phase. But treatment and recovery plans do require the involvement of the unit leader. So we never want to leave them out at any phase. It's just sort of figuring out who's got the lead role where. Next slide. So this is the application of this. I think many of you know that in the United States, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for doing diagnosis as opposed to the ICD codes. But the important thing is what we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan changed how the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is done in the United States. And I'm going to oversimplify a little bit, but basically what has happened is reactions and symptoms were kind of combined into one cluster versus having the immediate event or the immediate reaction to an event. But all the rest basically stayed the same. Oh, and then, you know, we went from three dimensions for PTSD to 4. And people are still arguing about whether they're 3 or 4 or 5. I don't think it really matters, because the most important thing in any mental health diagnosis is the individual impaired. And the impairment aspect for PTSD hasn't really changed that much, right? There is this new thing, perhaps a moral injury component, but we can talk about that later. It's almost a separate presentation. But that's the DSM approach, and it takes a very victim-focused approach, I would argue, that it looks for a traumatic event that is unexpected, that's discrete and typically unwanted. And it leads to a series of reactions and symptoms that can be categorized around 4 clusters that then leads to an impairment. An occupational view of post-traumatic stress disorder is very different. For one, some of the symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder may be adaptive. Okay, so I know, what do you mean talking about these mental health symptoms should always be dysfunctional, but they can be very adaptive. And as a simple example, think of hyperarousal. Hyperarousal is considered a dysfunctional symptom resulting from a traumatic event that's part of the diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder. But hyperarousal in a combat environment or in an unsafe environment could be thought of as hypervigilance. And being hypervigilant in an otherwise very dangerous environment can be very adaptive and actually could save your lives and lives of others. It's only outside of that context, when you're back home in a relatively safe environment, that what we would call hypervigilance, which is a good thing, becomes hyperarousal, which is a bad thing. Okay. So this is just one example. Dr. Amy Adler and I, again, have written a detailed paper on this, going through every symptom category and talk about how in certain cases they can be adaptive. But the most important thing here is that in the military or in an occupational setting, traumatic events are not unexpected. They actually are expected. They're varied, they're multiple events, they're repeated, and sometimes they're desirable. Some folks want to be in combat, at least from the US side. The first time they want to go in, they want to defend America, they want to show their courage, they want to show their mettle, show their toughness. So it's not an undesirable event as the DSM in many ways characterizes it. And the reaction often isn't sort of this freezing, intense fear. It's really more the training kicks in. They went on autopilot. They did as they were trained. Okay, these are all very adaptive. The symptoms can be quite different. I've already mentioned the moral dilemmas, the moral injuries that may result. But even the nature of how the impairment emerges over time can be very different in an occupational setting, because in the military, it's highly structured, very clear expectations, chain of command, command and control. And sometimes that can serve to mask the emergence of symptoms. And we call that suffering while functioning phenomena. So you can often get soldiers who are actually suffering, but they appear to be functioning fine. And it's usually because of the environmental structure in place that enables that. But once that structure goes away, then the symptoms emerge. Sometimes people call that delayed PTSD. I'm not sure it's a delayed phenomenon as much as it's a removal of the social support that was in place that enabled one to function at a fairly high level. But once that's gone, all of a sudden the performance drops off. And it appears delayed, but probably the underlying symptoms were always there. Next slide. So not all soldiers are at equal risk. This is a really important point. Let me show you some data to make this point. Next slide. Next slide. So when you just do a quick cut from combat armed soldiers, infantry, armor, field artillery soldiers, engineers, combat engineers, and you compare them to soldiers in the support, the logistical support, the personnel support, you see there's a difference in the overall exposure to combat events. It's not zero for the combat support and combat service support, but the amount of combat experiences are much less. Next slide. And when you look at these various occupations as a function of screening positive for a mental health issue, you see that it's much less for signal. I'm sorry for the formatting got changed, I guess, when I submitted this, than it is for like the combat arms and others. So in other words, you really don't just sort of broad brush and say, oh, you were deployed to the front line, you're all the same. There are important differences to keep in mind, especially in how you support these these various soldiers while they're engaging in these combat operations. Next slide. Here is just another example showing that in Iraq, we didn't have a traditional front line. My understanding from watching TV and reading the newspaper and following folks on Twitter, that there more or less is a front line in the Ukraine. In Iraq and Vietnam and other conflicts, soldiers were on base camps. But anytime they left the base camp, they were more or less on the front line. And when you look at the level of combat experiences, and then you looked at the likelihood of screening positive for post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or anxiety, really any mental health disorder, what you see are those soldiers who are in higher combat scenarios more likely to screen positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if you remember that very first slide I showed you for PTSD, it was about 15%, right? But here you can see it's nearly 30%. It's almost doubling based on whether or not they were in high combat scenarios or in low combat scenarios. So just keep that in mind as well. The level of combat, not just did you see combat, but the level of combat is also important variable. Next slide. There are cultural differences. So I'm going to show you two quick slides here. Next slide. Next slide. So I don't know how many of you know Sir Simon Wesley. Sir Simon Wesley and I are very good friends. By the way, this is the Queen when she was up and about before she died, actually knighting Simon. And Simon would show this slide, literally this very slide, minus the knighting ceremony. I added those pictures. But Simon would show this data and he would say, look at this, America versus United Kingdom versus Canada. And if you look at the percent of PTSD cases, it looks like Canada and the UK have very, very low rates compared to America. Right? That's what one would conclude from looking at this. And by the way, TELIC is what the Brits called their operation in Iraq. In Canada, it was just called combat soldiers. Now, Simon would speculate that the reason why the rates were so high in the US compared to the UK is because the UK had better leaders, they had better training. You would even postulate that the Brits had superior character that prevented them from suffering from PTSD compared to Americans. And in contrast, he would say the Americans are exaggerating their mental health symptoms to get disability ratings and to get out of serving, things like that. Well, if you understand that the United States deployed for longer periods of time than the Canadians or the Brits, they would deploy for about 5 or 6 months. Americans would deploy for an entire year. Americans were also younger, age-wise, by about 5 or 6 years. Just a quirk in the military structure. They were just a younger group of individuals. And they also, this is just from a personal observation when I was in Iraq, appeared to be engaging in more combat scenarios than our allies. Now, this is not any way to say our allies didn't do their fair share. They certainly did. But it just seemed that the US were doing the harder missions, so to speak. And they actually did a study where they took data from the United Kingdom, they took data from the United States and merged them into one data set and controlled for age, deployment length, and combat experiences. The next slide shows you the results of that study. Now, what do you see? Now you see that there's no difference between the rates of PTSD between the UK and the United States. However, if you look at alcohol consumption, Brits drink much more than Americans following combat after controlling for all of these three main differences that I just mentioned. And you can also see that the Brits are also more aggressive than the Americans. Now, I wasn't part of this study. This study was done by other folks, including Simon, and they didn't control for alcohol and its relationship to aggression. But my speculation is that most of this change in aggression is due to increase in alcohol. the point that I'm trying to make is don't just read a paper, look at a rate, and then assume it's different, that somehow something's going on differently because one country produces another rate, and minimize those important differences. I will tell you the United States spent a lot of time and energy trying to understand what the Brits were doing to have such low PTSD rates so the US could learn from them. When in point of fact, when you look at the data in a very carefully done analysis, it's the Brits who should be looking to the US to see what we are doing in order to improve things. Okay, next slide. Next slide. We have a few minutes left. So another thing to really point, leadership is really important for maintaining mental health and well-being. Next slide. Next slide. So here's an example that I already mentioned earlier. Good leadership in a high combat scenario can lower the percentage of soldiers and Marines who screen positive for mental health issues. In this slide here, you can see in high combat scenarios, it went from 36 to 17. In a low combat scenario, rates of screening positive for mental health went from 20 to 5, 20% to 5. Do you remember what I said, what was the rate of PTSD in garrison among soldiers who never deployed? 5%. So in a low combat scenario, even though they're on the front line, if you have good leadership, you almost can maintain the level of mental health that you would see in garrison when soldiers are not at war. Next slide. We also know family leaders who support family-friendly policies is important. Next slide. That's what this shows. You can look at it later. Mental health training. Next slide. So I was involved in developing a battle mind training program, and just think about battle mind training as mental health training, okay? And there's some key components to it that are on this slide, but you make it evidence-based, you make it so that soldiers and Marines can understand what you're talking about. You focus on a strength-based approach or positive psychology or resilience, however you want to talk about it. It explains highly conflicted or misunderstood reactions, so it normalizes things, but we don't say it that way. We just explain it to them. We make it team focused. So I don't focus on myself. I look after my buddy, right, or my mate, depending on how you use those words. And it's action focused. So it focuses on specific actions soldiers and Marines can take, not about learning new skills, but leveraging existing skills they already have because you know what the training they've gone through. Next slide. This slide here just shows that soldiers and Marines really like battle mind training. But just because you like something, that doesn't mean it's necessarily effective. But here, at least it shows that it doesn't turn them off. Their ears don't flop shut. They actually listen and they actually enjoy it. Next slide. Here's some data. And again, this is published in several places and 3 or 4 papers on these. This is a group randomized trial. Say again? Hello?
Oh, just go on, Carl.
Sorry, I thought somebody had a question. Anyway, but basically this slide here shows that if you do 1 hour of psychoeducation training or battle mind training, and you follow them up 3 months later, that the number of symptoms for post-traumatic stress disorder are greatly diminished versus those soldiers who went through sort of a standard stress education class. And by standard stress education, I mean classes that talk about eustress, astress, distress, training that has the Yerke Dotson curve. Soldiers don't care about any of that stuff. It doesn't mean anything to them, right? But giving them relevant training that's skill-based, that's a strength-based approach, very beneficial. And we've done 3 group randomized trials now, and they've all come out positive. I think it's probably the best well-tested psychoeducation training for soldiers going to combat, going to war, and soldiers returning from war. This study here that I'm showing you is for soldiers coming back from war. Next slide. So some policy considerations. Next slide. Next slide. So we've had the opportunity, remember I mentioned the wars lasted so long, to look at soldiers who deployed for a year, came back, and then got ready to deploy again. So this is data from a brigade combat team that's deployed to war, come home from war, and getting ready to go back. And what you see here at 3 months post deployment, it continues to go up. At 12 months, it really goes up. Now, that 12-month point is confounded with going back to war again, because we also have research that shows that if you've been to combat, once you start going back to combat again, it kind of activates a psychosomatic symptom response where symptoms go up. The point here that I'm trying to make with this data is, just because you've been to combat, you've been home, you haven't reset in a year later. Think about that. You've gone to war for a year, you've come back for a year, and your symptoms are still not returned to baseline. It takes a while to reset symptoms. And one of the things we tried to do was like, how can we facilitate that returning to baseline? We don't know how to do that yet. Okay, but that would be a great question, but we don't know how to do that. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is an important slide because it shows that for those of you who think that you can build resilience by exposing people to the stressful events, it doesn't protect them. And in fact, it just makes them worse. So this is consistent with the data I just showed you. If you've never deployed before versus if you're on your second deployment, your actually probability of screening positive for PTSD or any mental health problem goes up. In other words, if resilience is simply exposing someone to trauma, this doesn't work. It's not only exposing someone, but giving them the skills, right? The skills that you've developed, say through resilience building or battle mind training, to cope with the trauma. You can't just expose them and expect the exposure itself to inoculate someone from the demands. You got to give them a skill set in how to manage those. Next slide. So this is obvious. The longer you're deployed, the more likely you are to have a mental health issue, right? Because you're more likely to be exposed to traumatic events, the cumulative effects of the traumatic events. So this is really nothing new. The longer you're in a combat scenario, the more likely you are to be traumatized, the more likely you are to screen positive for a mental health issue. Next slide. Next slide. So here I want to talk about the moral issues. When you're in combat, soldiers are going to be confronted with moral issues almost on a daily basis, if not on an hourly basis, maybe in some situations every minute. Most of the time, they're going to make the right decision and feel comfortable with the decision they make. Sometimes they're going to make decisions out of anger, out of frustration, out of paying back for what the enemy did to my buddy or the atrocities the enemy committed. And they may commit atrocities. That can have an effect. Next slide. Next slide. Here it just shows that soldiers who engage in that kind of behavior are more likely to screen positive for a mental health issue. Okay, so is that a moral injury? Is it interacting with mental health? Probably yes to all the above. Just a sort of self-plug, I have my own theory of moral injury and how these two things interact, along with, by the way, Professor Dr. Eric Vermetten, that we try to explain how these two phenomena interact. But the point is, ethics training should be an important component to preparing soldiers for going into combat and for recovering. They're going to make mistakes. The idea is don't do it again, right? That's the idea. But once you make the mistake, you and I telling them, well, it was ambiguous, who knows what, they know what they did and why they did it. And so it's an issue that they will have to grapple with. We can help them grapple with it, but we can't talk them out. If they felt that they acted inappropriately, there's nothing probably you or I can say other than other soldiers do this. It happens. It's part of warfare. It's part of being in combat. Bad things happen. Good people do bad things. Okay, that's the reality of combat. That's the reality of war. And that's what we need to help our combat veterans overcome and recover from. Next slide. So there's a lot to remain. I'm not going to go through this. Lots of issues still out there. These are just some of them. Next slide. And if you have any further questions or would like any more detail about anything that I've said, I'm happy to send it to you, or you can get it from Iryna, or I can send it to her, etc. But that concludes my presentation, and I think I kept it to 30 minutes. Maybe I went over a couple minutes. Sorry, Iryna. Sorry, Eric. Sorry, Bob. But I'll
That's
stop there.
wonderful. That's wonderful. Let me chime in, if I may. I was disconnected in the beginning, Carl. It's a whirlwind of expertise that you're bringing to the arena. And I'm sure that there are questions. And if I may, then I'd like to pose maybe one or two questions. Is that okay to start with? Now, Carl, if there were any leadership listening into this presentation, and you made a couple of points, what would you tell the leadership to learn from this?
So leaders play an important role in that very early phase of the military occupational health model. Their behavior matters. They set the tone for the types of behaviors that they are going to condone and condemn. If leaders take the approach, take no prisoners, give them payback for everything they've done, they've just set the stage for atrocities to happen. Okay, that we know are going to have significant long-term downstream effects. Okay, they can also make sure that their soldiers they're leading are trained to what to expect, right? Have the necessary skills. So all of that is still very important. Equipping them well, training them well, giving them confidence, giving them great confidence, but also those skills that people die in combat, right? That they're going to face these moral and ethical challenges. And you can train soldiers to be prepared for these things. Doesn't mean it's going to prevent PTSD or prevent all of those mental health outcomes, but it helps a little bit. It helps them understand what they're going to do. You don't want to destroy their morale and their confidence going in. So this is a very fine line of how you train soldiers to do this, because you don't want to say, oh, you're going to go there, you're going to do really bad things and you're going to be beat, right? You don't want to do that, but you want to go in and say, look, you are going to be challenged like never before, but you have good training. Trust your training. You have good leaders. Listen to your leaders. Look out for each other. All right. There's some very basic things you can do. I don't think I sent our pre-deployment battle mind training. I'm happy to share that as well. It's a way of talking to soldiers that prepares them without demoralizing them, but builds up their confidence and let them know they have the skills to survive in return. That's what I tell leaders.
Thank you. You're making as always, very, very eloquent and wise points. Just to tackle on another question, if I may briefly. We talked about it prior to this session, and I apologize, I had to go to get my boarding pass on my next plane. But these are people, most of them are mental health professionals in Ukraine, and these are soldiers that are defending or fighting for their country. And what you showed was U.S. Soldiers and British soldiers that were fighting another war somewhere far. Now, just speculate, and maybe others may chime in that are in Ukraine. Do you think it matters? And in what way would it matter for the mental health toll? Would you likely be taking more toll if it was your own country, like we've seen? Joseph could comment on that. The Israelis fighting to defend their own land, and Arek Shalev has talked about this. Or would it not matter? Or in what way would fighting your own country matter for the toll that you're maybe able to take?
Well, I answered partially that question earlier, but let me sort of give that same answer, but expand a little bit. So I think that in the sense of fighting for your homeland, your resistance is going to be greater. Okay, your sense of dedication, your sense of purpose will be greater. You probably are going to tend to minimize your psychological reactions because you don't want to appear weak. Right. So you're going to put in more effort than you probably would otherwise. defending your homeland. It's not, doesn't mean you're not going to get post-traumatic stress disorder. We just have to look at the Israeli data to know that, right? So they're defending their homeland. They still have post-traumatic stress disorder. They still have mental health issues. So it's not a panacea, right? It's not the silver bullet. But you also may engage in unethical behaviors that you otherwise wouldn't engage in because you're defending your homeland, because so much is at stake. Sort of the proverbial, the gloves are coming off. There's no rule that I won't break in order to get a victory. So in one sense, one could see this as an advantage, but in another sense, it could be a long-term disadvantage, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to win with honor, because it's winning with honor that's going to prevent, to a large extent, I think, the moral injuries, the moral dilemmas, the moral questioning that a lot of combat veterans have. And Americans, veterans still have these issues today. So, and they were 5,000 miles away or 4,000 miles away. So it's a very complex phenomenon. I wouldn't say don't worry about mental health issues. You're still going to have them. But, you know, you want to prepare in the beginning for victory at the end. It's hard to do that when you're fighting for your very national survival. I get that. But at the end of the day, you're going to have a lot of veterans coming home who have this shared experience, and you want to be able to capitalize on that.
Carl,
Thanks,
if I
Carl.
could make a quick comment, just following up on Eric's and wonderful presentation with great wisdom and wonderfully presented systematically. Part of the issue of fighting for one's country, changes in battle, which you speak to eloquently, as do others, that in the midst of a battle, one's not thinking about one's country. One's thinking about the guy next to you on the right, on the left, and yourself. So the fighting for each other becomes a key component in all such wars. Thinking about coming back, and that these are principally a group of clinicians, your work on battle mind is so important. I mean, how would you see a group of clinicians either talking to leaders or talking to people with PTSD? What are the 3 things they should remember about battle mind to say? What should they say to the leaders? What should they say to their patients?
The most important thing, I think, is to focus on the strengths and skills that the leaders have and the individual has. I can't emphasize that enough. Recognize and recognize and normalize that there are always going to be these moral decisions that get made. And then the recovery takes time. So I know leaders want to know, okay, I've got soldiers, when are you going to get them back? A week, a month? I mean, it takes time. Some may be able to go back in an hour. Some may never be able to go back. And then there's going to be all the time in between. Leaders, I got that question all the time. I got a soldier who has a mental health issue. He's depressed. He has PTSD. Okay, how long do you need before I can send him back into the fight? Right? And we don't have an answer to that. It's not just because the symptoms go down and they no longer have a diagnosis that you send them back. I remember reporters would always ask me, does America send soldiers to Iraq who have PTSD? And I'd say, yes, we do. And they were like, it styled it like that I would say that. And they go, how do you know that? I said, well, I just know what the data looks like. I showed you the data from a brigade combat team. About a quarter of them still screened positive for post-traumatic. All of those soldiers, by the way, deployed, okay? All of them. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean they're not functional? No, of course they're functional. You can function at a very high level while suffering significantly from a mental health issue. We all know this as clinicians. Sometimes we don't acknowledge this to ourselves. There are a lot of high functioning people out there who do very nicely, and you would like, they've got all kinds of mental health issues, right? They still function very highly. We have a study, we never published it, but I was looking at veterans, and I wanted to show that if you were a veteran in America and you had PTSD, that your income earnings was less, right? To encourage people then to get help, etc. I found the opposite. Actually, some of the highest earning people were more likely to have a mental health issue than those who were earning less. And you know, so this is one of those things that I couldn't never figure it out. I could never publish it because I could never really explain it in any meaningful way other than to say, isn't this bizarre? Some of the highest earners in LA are suffering from PTSD and depression and other things. You'd say, well, you know, it's LA, right? I mean, so it would kind of get dismissed, but it's a really complicated issue, you know. And one of the things, to piggyback on what you asked, Bob and Eric, I always get concerned when you're fighting you're defending your own homeland, and when you kind of reach a breaking point, but you know the context is you can't just walk away without being thought a coward, a traitor, etc. That wouldn't increase risk for self-harm as well. Because the only way you're going to get out of the situation is by hurting yourself, killing yourself, to escape from this basically contextual, unescapable situation. We didn't really have that in the US other than the repeated deployments piece of it. But when you're fighting your own country, one can imagine, one could hypothesize that could be a very important variable to look for those indicators of self-harm. May not be suicidal, but excessive drinking, drug use, high risk taking behavior, those kinds of behaviors I would think may go up or tick up a little bit. I'll stop there.
Thanks,
you. Carl.
Thank you, Carl. And I just want to mention, because you told us that you would actually give a separate lecture on battle minds together with Oksana Bayer, a Ukrainian psychologist, in December. So
yes. Oh, I forgot to mention that. You told me to mention that. On 2 December, and Iryna, I will send you and Eric and Bob the details. They requested it. I think 2 December, I will be doing a webinar on battle mind training for an hour. So it'll be more in detail, and I'll go into all the explanations of the words we use, why we chose certain words, just the boring stuff, but it's really important in how you talk to soldiers and Marines that you use the right language. Otherwise, they're not going to listen. They're going to be paying attention to something
we will
else.
definitely share this information with our participants and our network. And I see here, Olena Nahorna with us already, who is going to share her her experience as a military psychologist, working with soldiers from Ukrainian armed forces. And Olena, it's honor to have you. Maybe you can share.
Пані Ірино, шановне товариство.
Just
Thank you. So it is an honor to me to be here among this esteemed audience, and it was a great pleasure to listen to Carl's presentation. Very powerful research, definitely. I'll be looking forward to browse the slides later. So I would like to say that currently, due to the changes in the type of military activities in Ukraine, the research we've done in the first phase of the war is not very relevant. Now we only start observations in this new phase of the war, but definitely we can confirm that the mental health, well, directly depends on the intensity of combat activities and the engagement in the intensity of engagement of the soldiers. But we'll be looking forward to getting the data, then we'll be able to talk in depth. So even some of the questions I wanted to mention were mentioned by Carl, and especially moral injury and its impact on mental health. I will try to be brief, and I will go point by point. I just want to share the tools I've used in my work, and it has helped me when I was transitioning the soldiers from war to civilian life. So I will try and share my slides now. And so when we talk about the transition to the civilian life in Ukrainian defense forces, mental health support is not as developed. And in our environment, this transition from the military to civilian life is rather a change in the social situation. And here, these status is important. In Ukraine, the person can have the official status of the war veteran or combat veteran or the so-called military disabled person. And different agencies issue these statuses. It's the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Veterans, and the Ministry of Social Policies. There's another status, another category, the former military service person. If, for example, the person didn't have experience long enough or didn't have combat experience, they have that status. So their mental health is just their responsibility. But military psychologists do have an important role to play. Despite that the fact that we are trying to find the model to provide mental health support, we now run researches and we try to implement different models of behavioral health in the army and in the National Guard. So far, we don't have any stable model. We keep searching. So after all, it depends on every individual psychologist. Can we show next slide where we talk about the motivation?
Olena, ви хочете, you
Oh.
want me to share the slides? Yeah, I can do that. Я можу
Якщо
поділитися
можна,
слайдами.
швидше буде, якщо ви зараз
Yes,
поставите.
it would be faster if you would share the slides. I'm sorry. I will be talking, and then if we can share the slides, it would be good. Otherwise,
Yeah, I can.
it doesn't matter. So, the procedure in Ukraine is the following. There are mental behavioral health services and it's part of the logistics, and it's a small segment. So before a service person is dismissed from service, they have to fill in a questionnaire, and it's called the conversation sheet. And there are a few questions where the psychologist is trying to identify the mental health status, the wishes, the motivation for retirement, where there are any complaints. There are about 20 questions overall, as set out in the regulation. However, we can say that the naturality, or like the organic nature of this transition essentially depends on the motivation to terminate the contract. So it depends on this motivation being negative or positive, whether the person terminates the contract trying to leave service, or they want to plan their life differently, they have some other goals. So these two categories are the key. And here we're talking mostly about the conscript service. We've had 18 months of conscription service, but now due to war, it's different. Also, there was the mobilization service. These two people essentially have this negative motivation because they want to leave the service, they want to finish their duty.
Добровольці, да, тобто люди
And we
висока
have to consider that there are also volunteers now, people who are highly motivated, and they might have certain psychological issues in the beginning of the service when they have high expectations. And most civilians who join the military service now during the invasion when the mobilization was announced, well, they have some ideas in their heads. They saw films, they want to defend their motherland, and they've been watching the media, and they have certain expectations to the army. And in any way, also the conscription service and the mobilization service, it's about the fulfillment of the civic duty. But also there are contract service persons who can be discharged also with the positive motivation when people just want to pursue other goals. They want to finish military service and start the civilian life. So they move towards something. But also, unfortunately, there are cases when the contract is terminated due to breaches and violations. And yeah, of course, it affects the psychological support of these soldiers too.
згаданих випадків, але в різних
Nevertheless, I mentioned many cases, but in all of them, to a various degree, one can say less intensity degree. One can say we can also encounter identity shifts when they return to the civilian line. The question of who am I? This identity crisis. Am I a former serviceman or a citizen? They struggle with self-identification. Firstly, on the one hand, the reason being is that military corporate culture has a profound influence on the personality. On the flip side, it's also the public perception of a person who comes back from the army, who comes back to living as a civilian. I could go on and on talking about identity crisis, but I don't have that much time though. A person is being prepared to leave the army, and during this time, it's worth asking a serviceman, so you come back to civilian life, who will you be? What's your vision for your life as a civilian? You do it to minimize and save person from abrupt shifts. So a person was with like-minded people, was surrounded with that, has no concerns about food or providing for themselves because it's usually provided for by the state, because the military have something to eat and they earn money through their service. So that question is tackled. And then the person moves to a setting when the person needs to provide for oneself. They need new skills. They need to try different masks on, so to say. And you need a person who can support by giving advice or just by being present. If that's not the case, the identity crisis is more likely to be prolonged. And the final question, people who I met asked this question: what do I want in my life after transition? Why did I survive? Why me? What's my calling? Why is the world so unfair towards the others? I think all of that needs to be discussed with the serviceman. You need to prepare the serviceman and to set the stage for him meeting these questions, or as he's in the process of meeting these questions. This is very significant. So as you discuss this question, and once again, I'm talking based on my own experience. I've been serving in the Ukrainian armed forces for 6 years now. And I have encountered all the categories of servicemen that I mentioned. You cannot force them to have that discussion with the military psychologist. But when there's trust, when there's rapport, when there's joint combat experience, shared combat experience, then approaching this existential crisis and all the questions are natural and sometimes are requested. Looking for the sources of personal sense. Like when you're discussing what is likely to come up, and we look for these sources of the senses. And the classical resources are love, caring for the people, creating a family, this aspiration for making a difference, creativity, coming in touch with nature, various social engagement. Our reintegration group has quite a bit of experience. We worked with people who were freed from the captivity, and we process these questions, and they come up with a lot of existential questions. If their captivity was characterized by dire conditions or they were subject to tortures, these people need new senses to augment the experiences they've had. We always plan. We plan the transition. We talk about basic areas of our lives: social sphere, family, finance, work, leisure, routines, belonging to the community and your contribution, and also mental, emotional, and inner self assessment and well-being, self-awareness. I would like to tell you about a tool that I encountered in my work, and I find it useful. It's by Kane Ramsey. This is the author. It's a workbook of restoring your balanced life. It was translated into Ukrainian a few years ago. The translation was done by the Revolution Foundation. This workbook has a number of survey sheets to work for the psychologist, and it also enables diagnostics. I'll show you what is the content, what are the questions. I believe as the serviceman is being prepared for the transition, it's paramount, on top of other psychoeducational trainings and individual work, and on top of training the servicemen to engage with the social field, it's paramount that prevention is also conducted. You also need to look for answers to existential questions. You also need to look at self-identification. I highly recommend this workbook. If you have more questions about working with the worksheet, I'd be happy to share a PDF file for you. In the interest of time, it's time for me to wrap up. Thank you for this opportunity to speak in front of you.
Thank you, Olena. Thank you. It's really important and to exchange experience. And whenever I talk with our international colleagues, they eager to know, of course, with what we deal and how we manage to cope. And you just showed us this experience. So I see in the chat, many comments that people are really interested to have both the notebook or the workbook that you just showed, and as well, Carl, really looking forward to your lecture about battle mind, and even asking, is it possible to share your training materials which you use with soldiers to work to work with military. However, Ruslana Tenetko, she didn't mention like during the service or after the service. Yeah, I think it's important.
Maybe we can ask Carl to comment on the presentation. Carl, based on what you just heard, any reflections do you want to share?
I love it. I loved every word that was said. I took my video off. I was still here listening. I hope folks didn't think that I just stepped away. I was here the whole time. You know, the point about identity, as mentioned, is its own lecture. Truly it is. Because, you know, the military really does form and shape one's identity. Obviously, the younger one is when they join, the more that identity gets shaped and molded and influences the whole transition out of the military and back into the civilian community. So it's a huge topic, and I love the idea of the workbook. You know, so there's just so much in there. It's just very exciting to hear. And by the way, I'm happy to share all of my battle mind stuff with whoever wants it.
Okay, so I will then just remind you by email, and we will put that materials to our website, and then we'll just share the link with our network. I hope it's okay. And Olena, yeah, please let me know if it's possible with the workbook. We can do the same.
Let's hear, Iryna, if there's some questions from the audience, either to Carl still or to Oksana. Please open up your mics. Yes, open up your mics in whatever language. Let's hear from you.
Because I see here people from the military. Andriy is here, Oleg is here.
Ah, yes. Andriy is here, okay.
Yeah, I don't know what is the connection, but yeah, so I see here Tatiana as well, who is working a lot with military and families. Yeah, we just mentioned it as, briefly, but it's crucial. Yeah, please don't be shy, just raise your hand and speak out, comment, ask.
Maybe if Andriy is listening in, because Andriy will be speaking at a conference in the beginning of November in Düsseldorf, Disasters in Military Mental Health. Andriy, are you here with us? I cannot see you, but if you can hear us, maybe you can.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Good evening. I can hear you very well. Thank you for wonderful presentations. And thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a miracle. Thank you.
Glad to have you. We're privileged.
We have several comments in the chat while Carl was talking, and actually it's in English, so I can read it, and then our Ukrainian audience will hear the translation. So Olga says that, thank you, Carl. It's great training. I use materials of soldiers' resiliency and post-deployment training. Great to hear you in person. Yeah, so people already use your training, it looks like.
Thank you. We've been using actually battle mind conception from, I think, 2016, maybe 2015. It was a small group of psychologists who work with combatants prepared to deployment and during deployment in the fields. And one of things we did for them, we have education about battle mind, just like you have a list, this list, and according to your list. And recently I was looking to refresh my knowledges, and I found your presentation in open source, and now I'm using them very active. Thank you.
That's great. And another comment was that, bravo, your words are so precious. You can't just impose person to the stress and expect it will inoculate with the stress. You have to teach some skills. That's what I'm thinking today a lot, says Oleg Hukovsky. And Oleg, if you're with us, please jump in, or maybe, yeah, Olena, maybe you can as well comment on that, or Olga.
Якщо дозволите, я пару слів скажу.
If I may, I'll say a couple of words. I really would like to reflect on this statement. Ukraine has this experience of doing the so-called stress inoculation trainings. It happened back in 2016 and 2017. This enabled for us to effectively engage with GPRA. This is the Personnel Recovery Agency. So we considered whether we wanted to do trainings on survival and resisting enemy environment. And sometimes people play the certain role plays, and modeling it was involved as we did it. And we realized if people are exposed to deep traumatic experiences without preparing them correctly and without actual need, and we find out that it has a negative effect on the person. You need to prepare them gradually. You need to balance the load. Sadly, sometimes, well, people do a bit of a show, I would say. They use the stress inoculation and they use force and different traumatic elements, and they make it a part of the training. Yes, it definitely does more harm or exposes people to risk as opposed to doing good. Thank you.